The roar of aircraft engines shattered the peaceful Hawaiian morning as the first wave of Japanese planes appeared over the horizon. The time was 7:48 a.m., December 7th, 1941, a date that would forever be etched into American history as a day of infamy. Below, the unsuspecting sailors of the United States Pacific Fleet were beginning their Sunday routines, unaware that their world was about to be violently upended. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the Japanese air attack, watched with calculating precision as his forces approached their target. "Tora! Tora! Tora!" He radioed back to his superiors, the code confirming complete surprise had been achieved. 183 aircraft now descended upon Pearl Harbor, their rising sun insignias gleaming against the clear blue. Sky Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, had received warnings of possible Japanese aggression in the Pacific, but like many American military leaders, he never imagined an attack would come to Hawaii. The island's seeming isolation from the brewing conflicts across the Pacific had created a dangerous sense of security. Intelligence reports suggesting Japanese carrier movements had been noted but not acted upon with urgency. This context is taken from At Dawn We Slept, The Untold Story of Pearl Harbor by Gordon W. Prang, which meticulously documented the intelligence failures leading up to the attack. Aboard the USS Arizona, Seaman First Class Donald Stratton had just finished breakfast and was looking forward to a relaxed Sunday. The 22-year-old from Nebraska had joined the Navy to see the world beyond his small hometown. The 19,000-ton battleship had been his home for nearly a year, and he had grown fond of Hawaii's tropical paradise, so different from the Great Plains where he was raised. Across the harbor on Ford Island, civilian Kathy Foss was preparing breakfast for her family in their naval housing unit. Her husband, a lieutenant in the Navy, had left early for his shift. Their two young children played in the yard, enjoying the warm morning sunshine. The Foss family represented hundreds of military families who had made Hawaii their home, creating a vibrant community around the naval base. In Washington, D.C., negotiations between Japanese diplomats and American officials were still technically ongoing. Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu had been tasked with presenting Japan's final proposal to Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Their instructions were to deliver this message precisely 30 minutes before the attack began, not as a warning, but as a formal break in relations that would protect Japan from accusations of launching a sneak attack. Due to delays in transcribing the lengthy message, this diplomatic gesture would fail spectacularly. The Japanese strike force had departed in strict secrecy from Tankan Bay in the Kuril Islands 11 days earlier. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the audacious plan, had argued forcefully for the preemptive strike. Though personally opposed to war with America, having studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington, Yamamoto understood Japan's strategic dilemma. "If we must fight," he reportedly told his government, "then let us strike first, and strike hard." 6 aircraft carriers formed the core of the Japanese fleet: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Together they carried the aircraft that would deliver the devastating blow. The force had maintained radio silence throughout their journey, successfully evading detection by American intelligence assets. Now, as the first wave approached their target, the element of surprise remained completely intact. At Pearl Harbor, the morning colors had just been raised. The sweet sounds of military bands practicing for morning colors drifted across the harbor. Ships sat peacefully at their moorings, arranged in neat rows, perfect targets. No one looked up at the approaching aircraft until the first bombs began to fall. The first Japanese bomb struck Ford Island Naval Air Station at precisely 7:48 a.m. Explosions erupted across the military airfields, destroying American aircraft neatly parked in rows, positioned this way to protect against sabotage, but ironically making them perfect targets for an air raid. Within moments, black smoke billowed into the sky as ammunition depots, hangars, and planes erupted in flames. Commander Logan Ramsey was in the Ford Island operations office when he felt the building shake. Racing outside, he looked up to see aircraft with distinctive red circles on their wings. His response was immediate and decisive. "Air raid, Pearl Harbor. This is no drill." The message, transmitted at 7:52 a.m., was the first official alert of the attack. Aboard the USS Nevada, machinist's mate second class. Charles Sahay had just finished breakfast when the first explosions rocked the harbor. "I thought someone was conducting some kind of stupid drill," he would later recall. That misconception vanished when he reached the deck and saw the carnage unfolding around him. Japanese dive bombers screamed toward their targets, while torpedo planes approached low over the water. This eyewitness account is documented in Pearl Harbor, From Infamy to Greatness, by Craig Nelson, which compiled testimonies from dozens of survivors to create a minute-by-minute timeline of the attack. The Oklahoma, moored outboard of the Maryland, took multiple torpedo hits early in the attack. Within minutes, the massive battleship began to roll over. Men trapped inside frantically tried to escape as compartments flooded and the ship listed further. Machinist's mate first class Robert West found himself in darkness as the ship capsized. "I could hear the ship turning. Metal was groaning and water was rushing in," he later testified. West and 32 others would eventually escape by crawling through a small porthole opened by rescuers with cutting torches. On Battleship Row, the Arizona became the attack's most tragic loss. At approximately 8:10 a.m., a modified 16-inch naval shell from a Nakajima B-5N Kate bomber penetrated the forward deck. The bomb detonated the forward ammunition magazine, causing a cataclysmic explosion that tore the battleship apart. The fireball rose over 500 feet into the air, and the concussion was felt miles away. In an instant, 1,177 men perished, nearly half the total American casualties of the entire attack. The horror aboard the Arizona was witnessed by countless observers across the harbor. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua, the ship's damage control officer, maintained remarkable composure amid the devastation. Although stunned by the explosion, he recovered to organize firefighting efforts and evacuation of the wounded. "I can still see him standing there," recalled Seaman First Class Donald Stratton, completely calm in the face of utter chaos, directing men over the side and helping the wounded. Fuqua would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. Japanese pilots executed their attack with precision born from months of intensive training. Torpedo planes approached from the northeast, using the ideal shallow run to the harbor. Dive bombers attacked from all directions, targeting airfields, first to prevent American planes from mounting a defense. High-level bombers followed, focusing on the battleships moored along Ford Island. The coordination reflected the meticulous planning overseen by Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant tactical aviation officers. Throughout the Ise harbor, American servicemen scrambled to defense positions. Despite the surprise and confusion, numerous acts of courage occurred in those first chaotic minutes. At the Army's Schofield Barracks, Privates Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott had actually detected the approaching Japanese aircraft on a new radar installation at Opana Point. Their report, made at 7:15 a.m., was dismissed by the inexperienced lieutenant on duty as a flight of American B-17 bombers expected from California. By 8:20 a.m., just 30 minutes after the attack began, Pearl Harbor had been transformed from a peaceful naval base to a hellscape of burning ships, shattered aircraft, and dying men. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft began to withdraw, American forces mounted whatever defense they could manage. The initial shock had passed, and training now took over despite the devastation surrounding them. Gunners aboard ships still capable of fighting found their courage and their aim, sending anti-aircraft fire into the sky with increasing accuracy. Aboard the light cruiser USS Helena, Seaman First Class Richard Cunningham had never fired the ship's anti-aircraft guns outside of practice drills. Now, with hands steady despite the chaos, he tracked Japanese aircraft through his sights. "We had no time to be scared," he later wrote in his memoir. "The training just kicked in, and I found myself loading and firing almost automatically." The Helena's gunners would claim 4 enemy aircraft shot down during the attack. At Kaneohe Naval Air Station, Chief Aviation Ordnance Man John Finn mounted a 50 caliber machine gun on an exposed instruction stand. For over 2 hours, he fired at Japanese aircraft despite receiving 21 distinct wounds. "I was out there shooting the Japs, and just every so often I was getting hit," he recalled with remarkable understatement. Finn's extraordinary courage would earn him the first Medal of Honor awarded in World War II. This account of heroism is documented in Pearl Harbor: Final Judgment by Henry C. Clausen and Bruce Lee, which investigated both the intelligence failures and extraordinary acts of bravery during the attack. The second wave of 170 Japanese aircraft arrived over Pearl Harbor at 8:50 a.m., led by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki. American resistance was noticeably stronger now. Anti-aircraft batteries around the harbor fired with greater coordination, and smoke from burning ships partially obscured targets. Japanese pilots reported encountering significantly more opposition than the first wave had faced. At Hickam Field, despite the destruction of nearly half the aircraft on the ground, Lieutenant George Welch and Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor had managed to get airborne from Halewa Field, a small auxiliary strip where they had been practicing. Flying P-40 Warhawk fighters, they engaged the Japanese without hesitation. Between them, they would be credited with shooting down 6 enemy aircraft. "They came in low over Wheeler Field," Taylor later described. "I just dove on the rear planes and started shooting." In the harbor itself, the destroyer USS Helm got underway at 9:10 a.m. One of the first ships to do so, Captain Chester Nimitz Jr., navigated through the chaos, seeking to engage enemy aircraft and assist stricken vessels. The Helm's swift response was emblematic of the growing American counterattack that would ultimately limit Japanese success. In the second wave, the battleship Nevada achieved perhaps the most poignant moment of resistance. Despite being hit by a torpedo early in the attack, her crew managed to get the ship underway, the only battleship to do so during the attack. As the Nevada steamed past the burning Arizona, her band assembled on deck and played the Star-Spangled Banner, an act of defiance that inspired cheers from sailors across the harbor. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas made the painful decision to beach the ship rather than risk having it sunk in the narrow channel, which would have blocked the harbor entrance. Civilian residents of Oahu witnessed the attack with horror and disbelief. Catherine Awa, a Hawaiian resident living near Pearl Harbor, described seeing Japanese aircraft flying so low she could see the pilots' faces. "We thought it was some kind of practice at first," she recalled in a 1991 interview. "Then we saw the explosions and knew it was real." Throughout Honolulu, civilians sought shelter as stray bullets and occasional bombs fell in residential areas. By 9:45 a.m., the second wave of attackers had departed. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force, faced a critical decision. His aircraft had achieved tremendous success, sinking or severely damaging 8 battleships and numerous other vessels. The American aircraft carriers, primary targets of the operation, were fortunately absent. Nagumo's pilots urged him to launch a third wave attack targeting the submarine base, oil storage tanks, and repair facilities. Such damage might have crippled the Pacific Fleet for months or years. Ultimately, Nagumo chose caution over audacity. His force had achieved tactical surprise twice, but American defenses were now fully alert. His aircraft had suffered increasing casualties during the second wave. Without knowing the location of American carriers that might threaten his fleet, Nagumo ordered withdrawal. This decision would later be scrutinized as one of the great strategic errors of the war. As smoke continued to rise from Pearl Harbor, the full extent of the devastation became clear. 21 American ships had been sunk or severely damaged. 347 aircraft were destroyed or damaged. Most devastating was the human toll. 2,403 Americans killed, with another 1,178 wounded. The Japanese, by comparison, lost just 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines, with 64 personnel killed. The attack had achieved its immediate objective, crippling the Pacific Fleet's battleship force. The Arizona and Oklahoma were total losses. The California, West Virginia, and Nevada suffered severe damage that would require extensive repairs. Yet several crucial targets remained untouched. The submarine base, oil storage facilities, and repair yards emerged unscathed. Most significantly, All three Pacific Fleet aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were at sea during the attack and escaped damage entirely. Commander Joseph Rochefort, head of the Combat Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor, surveyed the wreckage with grim determination. "They got the old ships," he reportedly told his staff, "but they missed the carriers and the submarines. This isn't going to play out the way they think." Rochefort's cryptanalysis team would later play a crucial role in turning the tide of the Pacific War by breaking Japanese naval codes. This strategic assessment appears in Joe Rochefort's War by Elliot Carlson, chronicling how naval intelligence recovered from Pearl Harbor to achieve decisive advantages later in the conflict. Rescue. Efforts began immediately and continued for days. The most dramatic occurred aboard the capsized Oklahoma, where rescuers worked frantically to free sailors trapped in air pockets within the hull. Using pneumatic hammers and cutting torches, they worked through the night of December 7th and into the following days. The last survivor, Fireman First Class Walter Cosgrove, was pulled from the ship 32 hours after it capsized. Admiral Husband Kimmel watched the destruction from his headquarters, at one point having a spent bullet narrowly miss him and crash through his office window. "It would have been merciful had it killed me," he later confessed, foreseeing the inevitable blame that would fall upon his command. Within 10 days, both Kimmel and Army Lieutenant General Walter Short would be relieved of command and subsequently forced to retire. News of the attack reached Washington, D.C. shortly after 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was having lunch with advisor Harry Hopkins when Navy Secretary Frank Knox called with the stunning news. Hopkins initially refused to believe the report, suggesting it must be an error or exaggeration. Roosevelt, however, immediately grasped the significance. "No," the president responded. "The Japanese are very meticulous and clever planners. They would not commence hostilities without making sure of the element of surprise." Across America, citizens learned of the attack primarily through radio broadcasts that interrupted regular Sunday programming. At the NBC studios in New York, announcer Robert Brown delivered one of the first bulletins. "The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. Hawaii by air," President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack was also made on naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu. The news triggered a wave of shock, anger, and patriotic resolve across the nation. In San Francisco, 22-year-old Navy recruit William Manchester was attending a movie theater when the film stopped and the house lights came up. "All Navy personnel are ordered to report to their ships or stations immediately," came the announcement. Manchester would later write in his memoir that he noted the strange silence as he and other servicemen filed out, civilians watching without speaking, suddenly aware their nation was at war. On December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress, delivering his famous Day of Infamy speech. In just 6 minutes, he outlined the unprovoked nature of the attack and asked for a declaration of war against Japan. The speech, broadcast live across America, concluded with words that galvanized the nation. "With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God." Congress approved the declaration with only one dissenting vote. The smoke had barely cleared from Pearl Harbor when America began its transformation from a peacetime nation to the arsenal of democracy. The attack accomplished what years of debate could not. It united a divided country with a single purpose. Isolationism, which had dominated American foreign policy discourse throughout the 1930s, vanished overnight. Citizens who had opposed involvement in foreign wars now lined up at recruitment offices across the country. In Detroit, automobile factories began conversion to military production within weeks. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler shifted from civilian vehicles to tanks, aircraft engines, and jeeps. William Knudsen, president of General Motors before being appointed by Roosevelt to lead war production efforts, promised, "We won't fail." By 1942, not a single civilian car rolled off American assembly lines. All industrial capacity was dedicated to war materiel. The Pearl Harbor attack triggered social transformations as well. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking industrial jobs previously reserved for men. The iconic Rosie the Riveter image emerged as a symbol of this dramatic change. Rose Will Monroe, working as a riveter at the Willow Run aircraft factory in Michigan, became the face of millions of women who sustained war production while men fought overseas. This societal transformation is chronicled in No Ordinary Time by Doris Kearns Goodwin, which examines how Pearl Harbor catalyzed revolutionary changes in American society and industry. Military recruitment offices were overwhelmed in the days following the attack. Jack Lucas, just 14 years old, lied about his age and enlisted in the Marine Corps. "I wanted to get back at the Japanese," he later explained. Lucas would go on to become the youngest Medal of Honor recipient of World War II for his actions at Iwo Jima. His story reflected the patriotic fervor that swept the nation, transcending age, class, and regional differences. On the Hawaiian Islands, martial law was declared immediately after the attack. Lieutenant General Delos Emmons, who replaced General Short as military governor, instituted blackouts, curfews, and censorship. Civil liberties were curtailed as fear of a Japanese invasion persisted for months. Hawaiian residents of Japanese descent faced particular suspicion, despite no evidence of their involvement in or support for the attack. In California and other Western states, paranoia regarding Japanese Americans intensified. Earl Warren, then Attorney General of California, became a leading voice advocating for their removal from coastal areas. By February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the internment of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were natural-born citizens. Fred Korematsu's legal challenge to this order reached the Supreme Court, which upheld the internment in a decision now widely regarded as one of the court's greatest failures. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had planned the Pearl Harbor operation, despite his personal reservations about war with America, reportedly wrote in his diary, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Though historians debate whether he actually wrote these words, they accurately captured the consequences of the attack. America's industrial might, previously untapped for war, would eventually produce ships, planes, and weapons in quantities that Japan could never match. Pearl Harbor itself underwent a remarkable transformation. The oil-slicked waters that had burned on December 7th soon hosted round-the-clock salvage operations. Rear Admiral William Furlong directed efforts that seemed impossible at first, raising sunken battleships and returning them to service. The California, West Virginia, and Nevada would all fight again. Even more impressively, by January 1942, the harbor's repair facilities were working at full capacity, servicing the submarines and carriers that would soon take the war to Japan's doorstep. As 1941 gave way to 1942, the psychological impact of Pearl Harbor evolved as well. Initial shock and anger transformed into determination and confidence. The slogan, "Remember Pearl Harbor," appeared on posters, buttons, and billboards nationwide. Songs like "Let's Remember Pearl Harbor" and "Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition" became popular hits. Pearl Harbor was no longer just a devastating surprise attack. It had become the rallying cry for a nation at war. On September 2nd, 1945, representatives of the Japanese Empire stood on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay to sign instruments of surrender. This mighty battleship, commissioned in June 1944, represented America's astonishing recovery from Pearl Harbor. In less than 4 years, the United States had mobilized its industrial and military power to defeat enemies on 2 fronts, developing revolutionary technologies and strategies along the way. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had replaced Admiral Kimmel as commander of the Pacific Fleet 10 days after the attack, signed the surrender document for the United States. Under his leadership, the devastated fleet at Pearl Harbor had transformed into the most powerful naval force in history. The symmetry was not lost on those present. A war that began with a surprise attack on American naval power ended with that same Navy accepting enemy surrender in Japan's home waters. For survivors of Pearl Harbor, the journey from that December Mourning to final victory had been long and costly. Donald Stratton, who had suffered burns over 70% of his body aboard the Arizona, endured months of painful recovery before re-enlisting to continue the fight. "We finished the job," he stated simply after Japan's surrender. Stratton's story of resilience mirrored that of his nation, wounded but undefeated, ultimately prevailing through perseverance and sacrifice. This account of the connection between Pearl Harbor and ultimate victory appears in Pacific Crucible by Ian W. Toll, which traces how the disaster at Pearl Harbor led to America's transformation into a global superpower. The wreck of the USS Arizona remained where it sank, becoming a permanent tomb for 1,102 sailors and Marines who could not be recovered. Oil still seeps from its ruptured fuel bunkers, often described as black tears shed by the fallen. In 1962, a memorial structure was built over the sunken battleship, accessible only by boat. More than 1 million visitors come to this solemn site each year to pay respects and reflect on the consequences of war. Pearl Harbor's place in American memory evolved over decades. Initial government investigations, including the Roberts Commission established just 9 days after the attack, sought to assign blame for the military's unpreparedness. Admiral Kimmel and General Short bore much of this blame officially, though historians have since recognized the systemic intelligence failures that extended to Washington. Not until 1999 did Congress pass a resolution acknowledging that Kimmel and Short had been made scapegoats for broader failures. The question of whether President Roosevelt had foreknowledge of the attack became a persistent conspiracy theory. Revisionist historians like Charles Beard suggested that Roosevelt deliberately provoked Japan and withheld warnings to justify American entry into the war. Comprehensive historical research, including declassified intelligence documents, has thoroughly discredited these claims. The attack succeeded because of effective Japanese operational security, American intelligence failures, and the psychological inability of military leaders to imagine such a bold strike. For Japanese Americans, Pearl Harbor cast a long shadow. Even as many of their sons volunteered from internment camps to serve in the highly decorated 442nd Regimental Combat Team, their families remained confined as suspected enemies. Not until the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 did the United States formally apologize and provide reparations for this injustice. When President Ronald Reagan signed the legislation, he acknowledged, "Here we admit a wrong. Here, we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law." Relations between Japan and the United States underwent a remarkable transformation in the decades following World War II. From bitter enemies to close allies, the two nations built economic and security partnerships that endure to this day. In 1991, on the 50th anniversary of the attack, Japanese Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa expressed profound remorse for the suffering caused by Japan during the war. American and Japanese veterans, once mortal enemies, met at Pearl Harbor in reconciliation ceremonies that highlighted how former adversaries had become friends. The last known survivor of the USS Arizona, Lou Conter, attended memorial ceremonies well into his 90s. "We don't call ourselves heroes," he once said. "We were just doing our jobs. The heroes are the ones who never came back." This sentiment reflects the perspective of many Pearl Harbor survivors, who viewed their experiences not as defining moments of personal heroism, but as the beginning of a national struggle that demanded sacrifice from all Americans. Today, the Pearl Harbor National Memorial preserves the site where World War II began for America. The Visitor Center provides historical context through exhibits that examine both the attack itself and its profound consequences. As first-hand witnesses have passed away, the memorial's mission has expanded to ensure that future generations understand Pearl Harbor not merely as a surprise attack, but as a pivotal moment when the United States embraced its role as a global power, a transformation that continues to shape world events today. The words inscribed on the memorial wall perhaps best capture Pearl Harbor's enduring significance. "To the memory of the gallant men here entombed and their shipmates who gave their lives in action on December 7, 1941, on the USS Arizona. Beyond commemoration of the fallen, Pearl Harbor stands as a reminder of the consequences of unpreparedness in a dangerous world, the resilience of a nation under attack, and the capacity for renewal and reconciliation, even after the most devastating conflicts.